Hello and welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week is on the regional security grid with particular emphasis on the current developments in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The bigger part, of course, is the announcement by the US President, Joe Biden, that the US will now withdraw from Afghanistan in the end of August. Earlier, it may be recalled that the date which had been set was September 11, which harks back to events 20 years ago, two numbers that have now become part of the security discourse, 9/11. In 2001, we had the Twin Tower enormity when the non-state actors carried out this attack. The United States was dazed, stunned, and we are aware that after 9/11 in September 2001, the US embarked on its war against Afghanistan, then the Taliban, which was called the Global War on Terror, GWOT. 20 years later, it is a very tragic story in terms of the cost effectiveness of what the United States and its allies had embarked upon. More so when the Taliban seems to be all set to return to some kind of power in Kabul. By itself, as a group, as an entity, or power sharing, we are not quite sure. But this is what I call as the tragic enormity, that if we had the Twin Towers and whatever America went through in 2001, we have a sense of deja vu that 20 years later, United States withdrawing, and it's not very clear as to what exactly has been achieved in terms of the larger political objectives for this very expensive military intervention, the war. But there is another strand, which is that India was a beneficiary, perhaps in an unintended manner, because of US action, meaning that perhaps young India may not remember December 1999 and what is called as the Kandahar hijacking, when the then Vajpayee government had a very difficult situation and the late Mr. Jaswant Singh, the foreign minister, actually had to escort Taliban terrorists to Kabul in an exchange deal. Many experts aver that India's own terrorism experience was influenced and shaped by these events. Be that as it may, there are many layers to be unpacked in terms of what is happening currently, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I have great pleasure in introducing and welcoming Mr. Rana Banerjee, former Special Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat and a Pakistan watcher of high credibility and long standing. Mr. Banerjee, welcome.
Thank you, Uday. It's a great privilege to be on your program. As you mentioned, the portents are enormous and fast moving. So the whole situation in the continent, and particularly in our western neighborhood, seems to be in flux. The rapid gains made by the Taliban, particularly in the entire swathe of the north and the northwest, northeast also, as also their strengthening positions in areas where they already enjoy support, that is south of Kandahar and in the east, Ghazni, and Pakhtiyar. It has been a little bit of a surprise the manner in which the Afghan National Security Forces morale has collapsed in the north. But as I see it, this may be a transient phenomenon, and resistance may come at a stage. As you would know, the Afghan government made some crucial and long overdue changes in the top leadership. The defense minister was changed. An old, experienced war horse of the Afghan army, Bismillah Khan Mohammed, was brought in as the defense minister to replace an ailing Asadullah Khalid. Also, the interior minister has been changed, and the chief of the army now, General Yasin Zia, is again a hardened soldier. So I visualize definitely an attempt by the Afghan National Army to take back some of the important district and provincial centers, as they have already started doing. Kalai now in Badghis has been retaken. Although the Taliban strategy is very clear, they are surrounding the district and provincial centers with an attempt to take over whichever area is less well defended. And another aspect of this entire fighting is a very Afghan characteristic to switch to the winner's side. So wherever the forces are arraigned against each other, if they themselves perceive that the other side is stronger, then they do not enter into a bloody fight. Rather, they surrender arms, and the village elders are called in to forgive and forget. And the Taliban have been quite flexible in adopting this policy. Again, this does not rule out fighting where the ANA is better organized. So this type of situation, I visualize, is likely to continue for some time. Where this will leave the overall situation of civil war, the unity within the Ghani government, these are questions which we do not have a very clear answer at this stage.
राणा साहब, एक बात है,
जी
पंजाबी में जो अभी आप कह रहे थे अफगानिस्तान के जो लक्षण है,
जी
एक कहावत है, कहते हैं कि जिद्दां जित्ते उद्दे नाल,
जी जी
that you go along with the winner.
जी
मैंने ये सुना है कि अफगानिस्तान के अंदर भी, चाहे पश्तो में हो या और वहाँ की जो जबान है, कि इसी प्रकार का एक वो मुहावरा है कि अगर आप अफगानिस्तान का इतिहास देखेंगे, बार बार जितना भी इन फाइटिंग हुआ है, अंत में ये जो पक्ष है वो समझ लेते हैं, पहचान लेते हैं कि इसमें कौन सा विनिंग साइड है। तो हमें यह मालूम है कि 20 साल पहले भी जब नॉर्थर्न अलायंस बना था, काफी खींचातानी हुआ था अफगानिस्तान के अंदर। उस वक्त भारत का भी एक खास भूमिका था। तो यदि आप अभी के जो वर्तमान है और आगे 3-4 साल की अगर आप एक अंदाजा कर सकते हैं, तो आपको क्या लगता है कि तालिबान जो है वो सीधा, क्योंकि वो पश्तू ट्राइब के साथ जुड़ा हुआ है एथनिसिटी के आधारित, वो पूरे विक्टर बन जाएंगे, वो विनिंग साइड बनेगा, या इतने एक्सटर्नल प्लेयर्स हैं अभी पाकिस्तान के अलावा, ईरान भी है, तो ये किस प्रकार से आगे आप तस्वीर क्या देखते हैं?
ये कुछ हद तक तो ये कहना बड़ा मुश्किल है, लेकिन जो पुराने वॉरलॉर्ड्स हैं उन्होंने अभी पूरी उम्मीदें नहीं छोड़ी हैं। वो फिर कहते हैं कि सेकेंड रेजिस्टेंस हम लोग कर सकते हैं। और ये जो वॉरलॉर्ड्स हैं, उस्ताद अता हुए या अब्दुल रशीद दोस्तम हुए या टखर बदख्शान में आप जाएं तो वहाँ भी अहमद शाह मसूद के रिश्तेदार जो लिया मसूद और अहमद मसूद जो उनके बेटे हैं, वो थोड़ी नीचे उनका इन्फ्लुएंस है। तो ये लोग लड़ सकते हैं, इन सब के पास सामग्रियां हैं, और ये तालिबान को खुली छूट नहीं देंगे। लेकिन इस बार तालिबान ने थोड़ी चालाकी की है, और पिछला जो उनका तजुर्बा था 1996 वाला, बहुत जल्दी नॉर्थ से कोलैप्स हो गया। तो इस बार उन्होंने नॉर्थ में दूसरी तरकीब अपनाई है। उन्होंने कि उज़्बेक और ताजिक मौलानाओं को भी अपने साथ ले लिया और लोकल कमांडर्स की हैसियत उनको दे दी लड़ने में। तो ये पूरी पश्तून फोर्स अब नहीं रही। जहाँ जहाँ ताजिक या उज़्बेक इलाके हैं वहाँ पे उन्होंने लोकल कमांडर्स को अपने साथ ले लिया है। तो इसमें उनको थोड़ी सहूलियत हुई है लड़ने में और इन इलाकाओं को कंट्रोल करने। और ये जो बॉर्डर का इलाका है, जो ताजिकिस्तान बॉर्डर है, खासकर वहाँ पे कहा जा रहा है इस वक्त की तालिबान का इन्फ्लुएंस या कंट्रोल सारे डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स में प्रभाव बरकरार हो गया है। अब आगे ये किस प्रकार से खुलता है ये कहना बड़ा मुश्किल। दूसरी चीज आपने कही कि जो रीजनल पावर्स, जो बड़े रीजनल पावर्स थे, ईरान कहिए या रशिया कहिए या हम लोगों ने मिल के जिनके साथ काम किया था, नॉर्दर्न अलायंस, पुरानी नॉर्दर्न अलायंस को फिर से उजागर करने की बात, वो इतना आसान इस वक्त नहीं होगा, क्योंकि रशिया के कैलकुलेशंस और ईरान के कैलकुलेशंस अब अलग अलग हो गए हैं। उनके नेशनल इंटरेस्ट थोड़े पहले से भिन्न हो चुके हैं। रशिया जो है वो कुछ समय से तालिबान के साथ बातचीत में लगा रहा है और कुछ मदद जिन्होंने की है आर्म्स आर्गूमेंट्स देने के लिए, उनका उद्देश्य ये था कि अमेरिकन किसी तरह यहाँ से जाएं। और जिस तरह हमको 1990 में हमारे मुंह पे कालिक लगी थी, इस वक्त हम ऐसा कुछ करें जिससे अमेरिकन को भी मुंह की खानी पड़े। तो इस तरह से उन्होंने तालिबान के साथ थोड़ा तालमेल बना के रखा है। अब बाद में तालिबान के साथ ये तालमेल रहता है कि नहीं रहता है रशिया का, ये कहना मुश्किल है। ईरान ने भी जो है तालिबान से वेस्ट में हिरात में और बात की फरा और नीचे जो है कंदाहार के पास नीमरोज, उस इलाके में तालिबान लीडरों के साथ संपर्क बनाए रखा था। लेकिन वो ये नहीं चाहते कि एक सुन्नी तालिबान फोर्स पूरी तरह से पावर पे आ जाए और हावी हो जाए अफगानिस्तान में। ये उनके हितों में नहीं होगा। इसलिए अब ईरान भी आगे आ रहा है एक नेगोशिएटिंग रोल में कि सबके साथ मिलकर एक पावर शेयरिंग फॉर्मूला नेगोशिएशन तालिबान को विवश किया जाए कि आप लोग और लोगों के साथ भी बात करके एक इंक्लूसिव पावर शेयरिंग या गवर्नमेंट बनाने की बात सोचें या समझें। ये स्थिति है इस वक्त। किस हद तक ये पावर्स इस एफर्ट में कामयाब होंगे ये कहना मुश्किल है। इसमें हम इंडिया जो है पेरीफेरी पे थोड़ा सा रह गया है इन सब डेवलपमेंट्स में और इन नेगोशिएशंस।
तो साहब हम संक्षेप में यही कह सकते हैं कि इस वक्त जो तस्वीर उभर रहा है वो काफी स्लेटी।
यस यस।
देखेंगे आगे क्या होगा। बट राना, कैन आई जस्ट शिफ्ट gears on to two issues related to Afghanistan, and then I would request you to move to Pakistan. Number one, the Taliban, they were in power. The way in which they had set out the strictures and the regulations as far as women were concerned, women and girls' education and that whole basket. What do you expect 20 years later would be the attitude of the Taliban, considering that many of them have grown up in these 20 years? Perhaps some of them have become fathers. In that sense, what is the socio-cultural change that may have taken place? And secondly, the other issue is China. Do you foresee any kind of role for China in the new power sharing that is likely to emerge and the new external impetus as far as the domestic grid of Afghanistan is concerned? So these two issues, could you
Yes.
kindly address?
Well, women's education, this has been a very popular phenomenon in the Afghanistan post-war accord from 2004 to 2021. And this is something which has forced the Taliban, despite their reluctance to eschew any ideological radicalism, to make temporary compromises by agreeing to allow from 2007 onwards to a fatwa issued then by the Taliban leaders to have limited girls' education up to in segregated girls' schools. Now, this has only partly met the aspiration of women and village elders even who are wanting their children to get educated, and also in the urban areas. There is a much more vibrant support for the idea of women education, women getting employment and jobs in the new emerging market. So I think the Taliban will have to make compromises or make their peace or adjustments with this, sentiment in civil society. To what extent they will do it and how reluctant they will be, I think they will make reluctant compromises at best. Because I don't foresee any major ideological changes in the setup that will come or emerge in the leadership. I may be wrong in this regard, but it's very difficult to assess at this stage. But this may be one major casualty which will be expected of the dispensation which the Afghan society got used to in the period after 2001. Coming to your other question about China, what sort of a role China would play. Now, China, of course, would adhere to what are Pakistan's national interests. It would sort of piggyback on Pakistan's national interests and show that it is there to support Pakistan. This is very basic. The second thing is, of course, they would like to come in with their economic diplomacy and invest in mineral exploitation, road building, extending the CPEC links into Afghanistan. But they would do so in a manner in which Pakistan would advise them and what would be perceived in Pakistan to be in Pakistan's interest. So I think that is a very clear line. We should not expect that China would do anything that would benefit or sustain Indian influence in Afghanistan.
But I think this is an appropriate time to make the transition to Pakistan. Two or three issues here, and let me flag them and you can pick up whatever you want. The first is in 2021, how do you assess the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship when the Taliban is likely to have a more dominant role within the domestic affairs of Afghanistan? And can one infer, let me put it that way, that Pakistan has gained strategic depth? If so, what was the genesis of the strategic depth, considering that the Pakistani military, Rawalpindi, we've heard this particular expression many times. Have they now realized that strategic depth? If so, what would it mean for the region? Meaning it's not just India, but even for Iran, or for that matter, the Central Asian republics. A Pakistan that has gained strategic depth, I'm not very clear, and maybe our viewers would also benefit if you could throw some light on this as to what is the strategic depth and who are the affected parties in terms of Pakistan Afghanistan.
Well, strategic depth was, initiated in the early 90s by General Aslam Bey. Basically, it meant having depth to preserve Pakistan's assets and influence from the main enemy, that is India. So, strategic depth in concept was to support and assist such players in Afghanistan who would be able to exercise influence and power to the exclusion of India. So this remained basically the main concept of strategy. Today, the Pakistanis, of course, pay lip service to the idea that we are no longer wedded to the concept of strategic depth, in the sense that if the Taliban come to power in Afghanistan, then the Indian influence will be totally thrown out, and that would be a hunky-dory situation for Pakistan. In their heart of hearts, the Pakistani military establishment still is wedded, or I suppose endorses, the idea of strategic depth, where Taliban become the predominant power broker or in power sharing, in whatever power sharing arrangement emerges, the Taliban are the dominant player. And this, they hope, will enable them to achieve the objective of excluding Indian influence in Afghanistan. However, there is a little bit of a dilemma or confusion in the manner in which this objective is to be achieved today, because there are doubts in Pakistan among the leadership and their military elite also as to whether they would be able to completely control the Taliban leadership if their victory is overwhelming and they move out from their safe havens presently inside Pakistan in Quetta, Peshawar and Karachi. If they move out from there and the leadership and their families feel that much more independent, then the streak of Afghan independence which is a very predominant streak which has been prevalent in their history, may prevent Pakistani dictation to be adhered to completely by the Taliban. And if civil war conditions prevail in fighting ensues, Pashtuns and Pashtuns or even Pashtuns versus other sectarian groups like the Tajiks and the Hazaras in Afghanistan, then there may be a spillover of Pashtun, both refugees as also sentiments on the Pakistani side. And there is a very disgruntled Pashtun sentiment which is simmering in Pakistan in the form of the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is anti-army in its connotation. They dislike the manner in which Pakistan army uh, moved into the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, destroyed the civilian settlements and the old prevailing, tribal hierarchy systems, without giving an alternative. There is a vacuum there in terms of political leadership for institutions. So also, resettlement of displaced Pashtuns from that area has not happened to the satisfaction of Pashtun civilians who believe in a civilian protest movement. That is essentially the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. Now, the army is very apprehensive of the force or the potential of this movement. So that is why there is a dilemma that whether they should allow the Taliban to have overwhelming control in Afghanistan or not. There is another aspect to it, that is of the rogue element of terrorists who identify as the Tehrik-e-Taliban, Pakistan, who have been attacking Pakistani military and police assets inside Pakistan from areas which they have some control on the borders on the Afghan side. Now, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan ideologically has a fairly similar mental makeup as the Afghan Taliban themselves. So, may not be prudent to visualize that the Afghan Taliban would, at the behest of the Pakistani military, take any retributive action against the TTP. So this is another dilemma which the Pakistan army and the political leadership is aware of and faced with.
There is a very interesting kind of school of thought, which I'm sure you're more than aware of, which talks about the possibility of the backlash, that instead of Pakistan acquiring strategic depth in Afghanistan, that it is possible that Afghanistan may have a strategic gain or an advance into Pakistan because of the presence of all the elements that you described, all the way up to Karachi. Right for now. And I am going to request you to actually look at another aspect, which is that the Indo-Pak relationship, which of course is an old chestnut, but there was some sliver of hope that perhaps things were getting onto a more stable track. There was some reference to quiet diplomacy and meetings between the NSAs and so on. But from early 2021 to where we are now, in the last week, we have seen a return to a very familiar pattern of tension and discord, and some very strong statements being released by both sides, particularly in relation to the blame game on terrorism. Now, we saw this in relation to Hafiz Saeed and the blast that took place. And in recent days, India has again, I think, issued a very strong statement placing the onus on Pakistan for supporting terrorism. So what do you make of this? Is Pakistan emboldened because of August 31st and the withdrawal of America, and therefore it believes that it can now increase its leverage against India vis-a-vis terrorism? Or what is this whole Hafiz Saeed thing
Well,
about?
I really don't think so. I believe this is going back to the usual Pakistani stand of throwing this red herring about Indian involvement. This is connected to their inability to come out of the grey list of the financial action task, where despite some cosmetic efforts or some even real efforts by them to address concerns about money laundering and the need to reduce criminal networks and linkages with such elements, Islamic terror elements, they haven't been able to convince the world about the genuineness of these efforts. And that is why they want to now put some pressure back. And because India has been a member of the FATF, they want to push some pressure back onto India by making allegations. They had brought out a book also, a dossier some time back to pursue similar allegations. Now, this is also, I believe, a sort of which Moeed Yusuf, the newly appointed National Security Advisor, feels the need to, provide to justify his inclusion in this establishment. As you may be knowing, Moeed Yusuf served long years in the U.S. Institute of Peace as an academic. In fact, he was quite well regarded by Americans when he brought out his book, Brokering Peace in a Nuclear Environment, U.S. Crisis Management in South Asia. He even came to India on a visa to sell this book or push this book in 2018, and he received a fairly good reviews from an academic viewpoint, where he talked of three-way brokered bargaining between regional powers and also big powers like the USA, each pursuing their interests in a coordinated manner to bring peace. But he was always suspect in his accusations made by an British or American academic, Dr. Christine Fair, who has written in a very informed manner on the Pakistan army, fighting to the end. And she made direct accusations about Moeed Yusuf's ISI links, even when he was working in the USIP. So much so that the US Institute of Peace, they felt trained to issue a formal denial in this regard. So now that Moeed Yusuf has been elected as the civilian face of this hybrid organization, which is controlled by the army in Pakistan, he feels the need to pay back by putting some pressure on India by devising this whole strategy of Islamabad security dialogue, and going back to the FATF, accusing India of doing their own thing, as Pakistan themselves get mired in a soup of these allegations.
Rana, in conclusion, let me request you to address one issue, which is that India has made a considerable investment in Afghanistan. The very fact that we have a large Afghan demography coming to India, both for healthcare and otherwise, I think is just one example. What do you see as the texture and the future of India-Afghanistan relations post the US withdrawal?
Well, primarily it will depend on the stability of the political stability of the government who controls Kabul. Otherwise, India has always, extended aid in a manner in which the Afghan government of the day wanted help from us, and that is why our image in Afghanistan is so good. And the schemes that we have gone in implemented, financial and material aid have been welcomed so popular in such a popular way. The dams and the transmission lines are regarded in a very favorable manner by all hue of Afghans, not only non-Pashtuns, but Pashtuns as well. So, and medical tourism, as you already mentioned. So I think there will be scope to continue assistance in these directions, provided the government of the day in Kabul would have Indian aid. There is the other complicated issue of threat to our assets, the attacks on our missions in Jalalabad and in Kabul, even Herat, which were attempts which failed, but there were other attempts which succeeded to create devastation and tragedy for our personnel. Now, this is something that India cannot forget and will have to factor in a hostile environment if it emerges in Kabul. So, to that extent, the government of the day would have to extend security guarantees, and otherwise I don't foresee any problems in our continuing the assistance sectors that we have been doing.
No, you're right. I think at the end of the day, whether it's the Taliban or another kind of coalition, as far as the people of Afghanistan are concerned,
Exactly.
they have, I would say, a stake or an interest in retaining this kind of a positive linkage with India. And I think the politics on both sides and the diplomats will have to steer this to the extent possible. But on that note, let me thank you, Mr. Banerjee, for sharing your thoughts with us, current and complex subject.
Thank you very much for that.
I think it would be fair to say that no region is likely to undergo fair amount of turbulence post the US withdrawal. Because for 20 years, there has been a certain security orientation as far as Afghanistan itself is concerned. And the very fact that the United States had this significant and large military presence had its own shadow, or I would say it was a kind of umbrella for those who were on the US side. With the US withdrawal, it's going to be a kind of a vacuum of sorts. And how that is going to be filled and what that would mean for the Afghan citizen is really going to be a wait and watch, as Mr. Banerjee, our guest, pointed out. On that note, let me thank you. Thank you for watching Security Analysis. We will be back next week at the same time. Thank you for watching Security Analysis, and Jai Hind.